There's another important distinction between different kinds of games. Some games are simultaneous. That is to say, the players all have to play at the same time without knowing what the other players are doing. Other games are sequential. You move, then I move. Checkers is a good example of a sequential game. So is chess. But there are other games that are simultaneous. People have to make their decisions and play at the same time without knowing what the other player is doing. A lot of video games are set up that way. A lot of sporting games are that way in some sense, or are a mixture of the two of these. For example, someone who is, let's say, playing hockey and trying to score a goal is skating toward the goal, and they are making certain moves at the same time that the goalie or any defenders are making their moves. Now, it is in some sense then a simultaneous game. Should I go this way? Should I go that way? I have to make the decision without knowing how that goalie is going to move. On the other hand, I also make a move, I see how the goalie reacts, and then I can make my next move, so can the goalie. So in short, we've got a combination there of simultaneous and sequential games. I have to move at the same time the other player is making the move. On the other hand, we can each see what the other has done and then plot the next round of moves. And we're going to look at a lot of iterated simultaneous games like that, where two people play at the same time, but then they see the result and then they play again at the same time. So we'll consider that an iterated simultaneous game rather than a sequential game. But when you think about a game like hockey or football or a variety of other things, it's really some mixture of the two of those. Let's talk about our other distinction between sequential games and simultaneous games. In a simultaneous game, the game players have to play at the same time as other people are playing without knowing what they're doing. So players are going to choose actions without knowing what the other players are choosing. What are some examples of simultaneous games? Well, the submission of proposals, grant proposals, for example, or other kinds of proposals in business is like this. You fill out the grant proposal. You don't know who else might be applying for that grant or making a proposal to get that contract. And so you have to decide what you're going to do apart from what other people are doing. You're all submitting the proposals more or less at the same time without knowing what kind of actions the other players are taking, or even often who the other players are going to be. The same thing is true of applications. Applications for a job, applications for a place at college. Any kind of application is one where you are submitting your application, deciding what information you want to convey. You don't know who else is applying, what information they're supplying. Auctions are like this if they're closed and sealed bid. You have to make your bid. You don't know who else is bidding or how much they're bidding. Football play calling is like this. You're there at quarterback, you've got to call a play, or maybe you're a coach on the sidelines. You're playing without knowing yet what the defense has in mind and what they are planning to defend against. Will they blitz? Will they fall back into a zone? You don't know at the time you call your play. Voting is like this. You cast your vote. You don't know who other people are voting for, at least if it's a secret ballot, and so you have no idea how the other players are playing that particular game. A battle is like this. I may have to move my army in a certain way. I don't know what the general on the other side is going to be doing. So I may decide we try to outflank the other army and move over to the right, but where's that army going to be? They're going to be in motion too, and we don't know where they'll be. Invitations are like this. I get invited to a party. I think, well, do I want to go? Depends who else is going to be there. But I may not know who else is going to be invited or how they're going to respond. Are they going to come? Are they deciding not to come? I may not know at the time. I have to make my decision to accept or reject that invitation. And finally, examinations are like this. I am taking the exam. Other people are taking the exam. And we're all doing that together. We don't know what the other players are doing. And we're all having to turn in our papers at the same time. It's not as if I can see what other people answer, see what grades they got, and then take my exam. We all have to be doing it at the same time. In a sequential game, in contrast, a player moves, then another player moves, getting to see typically what that first player did. So a sequential game is one where players choose actions before or after other players. Later players have information about previous plays. And that makes them very importantly different. You move on the chessboard, and then I decide on my move on the basis of what you've done. Then you see what I do, and you plan your next move, and so on. Each move gives the other player additional information. Well, there are lots of sequential games in business contexts, for example, and in other human contexts. So negotiations are like this. Typically, I make a proposal. You may reject it. You may accept it. Let's say you respond and say, I reject that offer. Then I think, well, okay, I'll offer this much. And we might be negotiating for the price of a house, the price of a car, a contract for a construction project, all sorts of things. Trials are like this. That is to say, one attorney presents a certain case, then the other attorney presents a certain case. Debates are like this. A debater makes a case, the other side responds, then the affirmative responds and tries to defend their case against those attacks, and so on. Admissions offers can be like this. Now, they aren't always. Sometimes a college has to decide at once who is accepted and who is rejected. And similarly, a business might say, well, all right, well, these people we're going to offer jobs to, these people we won't. And they do that as a simultaneous thing without knowing what people will do. But on the other hand, sometimes it's a sort of rolling admissions. And often what happens is we offer the job to this candidate. If that candidate turns us down, we go down to number 2 on the list, offer them the position, and so forth. Auctions can be like this if they're open bid. Somebody bids $2,000, I may say $2,100. I know what other players have bid, and as soon as I do that, they know what I've bid. And so they respond to that information. They find out what the last person or what previous people did, and they have the decision of making the bid or not. Social planning is often like this. We make one sort of move. We think, well, all right, let's build that road over here. We do that. We see then what happens, and we adjust our plan for the next series of roads. Dating can be like this. You choose that restaurant. Well, you get to find out how that goes over with your date, and so forth. Marriage can be like this. In general, in most human relationships, you're getting additional information as the person acts, and sometimes you're in settings where you both have to act at the same time without knowing what the other party is doing, but often you say something, then your partner says something, and there are these kinds of sequential interactions. Chess, we've talked about. Poker is often like this, maybe not always. There are aspects of it that are simultaneous, but many of them are sequential. Blackjack is like this. Well, we've mentioned debates and typically conversations in a marriage or not. So all of those are settings where you move, I move, you move, I move. We each gain information at each stage. Now, why is it worth going through these distinctions? Because in order to know how to play a game well, you have to understand what kind of game you're playing. Let's say you walk into an auction and you don't know whether it's going to be open bid or closed sealed bid. Well, that matters a lot in deciding what you're willing to bid, in deciding how to play this game. You need to figure out just what to do. You'd like to get a bargain on that item, but you really want the item, so what should you do? Well, in an open bid setting, you can make a low bid and find out what happens and respond or not, depending on how the pricing goes. But in a sealed bid auction, you can't do that. You can't respond. You can't lowball it and then find out, oh, I didn't get it. Instead, have a chance to respond. Instead, you've got to make your best offer right at the start. So, to form a strategy, you need to know what kind of game you're playing. How much information will you have about other players' decisions? You need to know that before you decide on a strategy for playing the game. And similarly, how much do your interests overlap with the other players? That's a critical question. Now, sometimes the answer is obvious. If you're playing poker, for example, or if you're playing chess, you understand that it's more or less a zero-sum game. But it's not true in a lot of other contexts. Sometimes there are real avenues of cooperation possible. Other times there is pretty much a pure competition or pure conflict. You have to understand what the situation is in order to understand how to play the game. So in general, you need to think about the relationship you have with the other players in the game. How much opportunity for cooperation is there? We can distinguish at least 4 possibilities. If we think about the extent to which your interests overlap, we can say sometimes it's possible to cooperate with the other player. There is some overlap among your interests. Now, it's not a complete overlap, but still win-win situations are possible. And so that's a situation that seems to call for cooperation. In other cases, it calls for compromise. It really is a constant sum game. And then you realize my gain is their loss and vice versa. Now, sometimes it's an all or nothing thing. You either win or you lose. But sometimes, as in budgeting, for example, it allows for compromises. You can split the difference. You can go halfway. You can try to get a little more than half for yourself. But however you do that, there's a possibility of compromise. Finally, there are situations of pure conflict, pure competition, where your interests are diametrically opposed to the opposing player. Lots of games are like that. Luckily, in ordinary life, fewer situations are like that. But it's important to know when you're in one, because then the possibility of cooperation or compromise is not there. You either win or you lose. And so in those situations, you have to understand that's the game you're playing. Win or lose, there is no halfway, there is no compromise, nor is there any possibility of cooperation for a mutually beneficial outcome.